This is Professor Grodman, and this is a review for exam number 2, Psych 111. We're going to review chapters 5 through 7, key terms that you really need to know for your exam, either next week or the week after, depending on which section you're in. So I won't specify dates because you have to look on Blackboard at your syllabus, your respective syllabi. Perception and sensation are the two highlighted areas in Chapter 5, although we're going to focus more on perception, which is the interpretation of sensory stimuli. It relates to the five senses, that being taste, touch, smell, vision, and hearing. It also relates to taste, sweet, sour, bitter, and salty. Highly, subjective and influenced by your biology and your learning history. Here are some additional terms that connect to perception. There's a point above which you perceive something, like a sight or sound or smell, below which you don't. That's the threshold level. If you have a 50% chance of detecting a stimulus, that is an absolute threshold. So those are important terms. Additionally, the more you're exposed to a sensory stimulus, the less reactive you become to it. A constant exposure of something, for example, a ring on your finger, leads to a sensory adaptation to that, where you almost have no response to it. That is sensory adaptation. Perception also influences how we think, and certainly think, and because it's interchangeable with that, and how we feel. There's an area of psychology and psychotherapy referred to as cognitive psychology and psychotherapy, and the basic premise here is thinking affects how we feel. So if you can restructure negative thinking, you may help a person not only think more positively, but feel better, and their behavior in turn will reflect that. An example of cognitive psychotherapy is rational emotive therapy, a term outside your book, but associated with Albert Ellis. Ellis talked about this being as simple as A, B, and C. There's an A, an activating event, a B, a belief, and then C, a consequence. Well, often the activating event is not a positive. You lose your job. The belief for some people would be catastrophic, not for most, but some. And the catastrophic view or belief of your life is over or you'll never find a good job again leads to depression. So how do you help that person? Well, you hopefully challenge that belief system, help them restructure it, look at it differently. And so this relies on the principles, certainly of perception. Moving into Chapter 6, learning is a change in behavior. Learning is the key here. And there are different learning theories. So it's a change in behavior, let's back up, as a result of exposure. In terms of names, we're going to go through several of them. Watson is considered the father of behaviorism. Pavlov considered the father or pioneer of classical conditioning, learning based on pairings or associations. Remember that Pavlovian experiment in which a meat is presented to a dog and the dog salivates. There's an apparatus in the dog's snout for salivation. The meat is the unconditioned stimulus, the response, the unconditioned response. They have little abbreviations for this. The meat is the UCS and the response, the UCR, the unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response. Then a bell is presented. And interestingly, the dog does not salivate. That's called a neutral stimulus. But then the bell is paired with the meat several times over. Bell, meat, bell, meat, bell, meat. You take away the meat, the bell alone produces salivation. This is called a conditioned stimulus, the bell. The response, salivation response now is called the conditioned response. If the bell is introduced for many times, many trials without the meat, extinction occurs. But it may come back. The bell may ring once and the dog salivates a little. That's called spontaneous recovery. The first person to actually use this paradigm or something comparable to it with a human being, well, actually two persons, John B. Watson, the father of behaviorism, and his assistant Rosalie Rayner at Rayner at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore in the 1920s. They used a baby, little Albert, did not have a learning history. Little Albert was presented actually with loud noise. He cried or was fearful. The loud noise was the unconditioned stimulus. The response to that, the unconditioned response. And then he was introduced to a rat. Well, the rat was essentially a neutral response. And then the loud noise and the rat were paired. And they were paired several times over. and the rat alone then produced crying. Now the rat is the conditioned stimulus, the crying, the conditioned response. I don't think they expected this or planned on this, but the little boy, I think he was less than a year old, little Albert, started to become fearful to anything when presented anything resembling a rat. Mink stoles even, but certainly guinea pigs and cats and any small furry thing. This is called stimulus generalization. Developmentally, he was not able to see the difference between a rat and a guinea pig, or a mouse or a cat, or anything that was, comparable, pretty close to that of a rat. If he were able to have made this distinction, and if he was older, he would have been. This is called stimulus discrimination. Finally, in terms of classical conditioning, we have Joseph Wolpe, who is the father or pioneer of systematic desensitization. The basic premise here is that most phobias are the result of classical conditioning, pairings or associations. So they knew for a long time, before Wolpe in the 50s, that exposure therapy works, because the more you're exposed to a stimulus, like a fear of heights, the less fearful you become. But Wolpe adds another piece, relaxation. This is a form of counter-conditioning. So he teaches people to relax and then be exposed to, let's say, fear of heights. He develops a hierarchy from the least threatening level of heights to the most, 1 foot, 2 feet, 3 feet, and so on. And you relax the person, then you expose them. Relax, expose, relax, expose. Either in real life, it's called in vivo, IN-VIVO, systematic desensitization, or imaginal, in your imagination. The real life obviously works better. And so this is a very effective way of counter-conditioning a person and getting them, exposing them and counter-conditioning them both. The relaxation, counter-conditioning, the exposure, graduated exposure, a little bit at a time, together, combined, is a great way of combating a phobia. In terms of the next area of learning theory, we're going to talk about operant conditioning developed by Skinner, not Freud. That's a Freudian slip. They were opposites, theoretical opposites, Skinner and Freud. Thorndike developed something called the law of effect. Behaviors followed by positive consequences are strengthened. Behaviors followed by negative consequences weakened. And Skinner said, this is sort of interesting. You could break it down in terms of reinforcement, where there's going to be an increase in behavior, and punishment, where there's going to be a decrease in behavior. And so you probably heard this, positive reinforcement and negative. And a positive reinforcer is something positive that follows a behavior, like a verbal praise. Well, that maintains or increases a behavior. Negative reinforcement is something negative is taken away following a behavior, like being yelled at or being chastised in some way. And that would also increase the behavior. If you take away something negative, you would do it more. Punishment is very different, because the consequence is something negative, like being, going to a light socket and getting a terrible, getting a terrible shock. That's going to reduce your behavior, not eliminate it, but reduce it. Skinner was particularly interested in the notion of positive reinforcement and said there are essentially sort of two types, continuous and partial. And if you reinforce continuously all the time, that's probably not likely to happen. But you are likely to be reinforced intermittently or partially. And he said you're either going to be reinforced partially either by time, interval, or responses, ratio. And he comes up with 4 schedules of partial positive reinforcement. Fixed amount of time, fixed interval, like being paid per hour. Fixed ratio, like knocking on a board every 5 times you get a candy bar. Variable ratio, based on a varying number of responses. The classic example here is a slot machine. Pull it 3 times, and 8 times, and 2 times. Varying number of responses. And that actually maintains the behavior the longest, because they don't use the term cognition, but they use the term expectancy. The expectancy is there's going to be a reinforcer. And so this maintains for a very long time before you have extinction. The fixed schedules, once you don't get every 10 minutes or every hour you get a paycheck, or every 2 weeks, actually better example, and the check's not in the mail after 16, 17 days, you're ready to quit. Variable schedules, you maintain the behavior because there's an expectancy. There's going to be a reinforcer that will be delivered based on varying amount of responses, variable ratio. or a varying amount of time, variable interval, like a check is in the mail in 3 days, 9 days, 2 days, 4 days. That's variable interval. That maintains the behavior much longer. Variable ratio is the most successful at doing that, most resistant to extinction. And it is associated with things like commission sales, gambling, the stock market, things of that sort. These models, though, they were lacking, they were actually very strong because they were quantifiable, they could be tested and proven, but they only involve stimulus response, a person responding to a stimulus, or an animal for that matter, responding to a stimulus. It didn't explain indirect learning, things that you observe. So Albert Bandura, who's the pioneer of social learning theory, comes along in the 1960s and says, yeah, Skinner and Pavlov, these people were right on, but what about watching something? What about viewing someone and observing their behavior? He did a study, Bandura that is, with aggression, and had kids watch aggressive material on television and found they were, and quantified this, they were more aggressive after watching this material. And so there is learning. They weren't aggressed directly, they were watching it. So there is learning that occurs observationally, and you can measure this. Another term that is often associated with Bandura's model is modeling. You observe behavior and you model it. I mean, think about YouTube going on or something on the computer and modeling something you see, learning to fix something or create something. You're modeling it, you're imitating it. So all of these fall under the heading of learning theory. That is classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and social learning theory. Now we're going to move into memory. Memory, we take information in, that's encoding. We then store it somewhere in the hippocampus physiologically. And there is memory we store for literally a split second, that's called sensory memory or storage. For 2 to 30 seconds, this is referred to as short-term memory or storage, or more permanent memory. Can be permanent, can be actually unlimited. This is long-term memory or storage, days, weeks, months, years. Your first telephone number. Actually, that's the law of primacy. You remember first better, or you remember last better, the law of recency. Cognitive learning involves, though, the transfer of information from short-term to long-term memory, in terms of retaining information, retention. So what's the best way to do it? Well, probably not maintenance rehearsal. This is a strategy to learn something and maintain it in long-term memory. Remember, this is rote repetition. Learning a poem, a script. This takes longer, it's harder, it's more arduous. But if you connect new information with previously learned information, that usually makes it more achievable. This is called elaborative rehearsal. Actually, not only achievable, it makes it more efficient. It's easier, hobbies, interests, just easier to learn that way. We gave an example that education becomes easier as you go up the hierarchy, just because it becomes more specialized, and you can employ elaborative rehearsal much more easily than with something that's more generic, that you don't relate to, that's not as identifiable. For most students, algebra and geometry and things like this are not as interesting. Some are, some find it fascinating. If they do, they're using elaborative rehearsal, but most students don't. We do forget. There is an almost infinite amount of material that can go into long-term memory, but we forget. We forget because of lack of use. We forget because of lack of cues. We also forget because of overlapping memories. The more information we have, generally the more subject or vulnerable we are to interference. So if something 5 years ago affects your memory today, that's proactive interference. If something today that's related, it has to be overlapping similar memories. So if you meet, two people who look alike or have the same name, or something behavioral is similar, you're of course subject to interference. Whereas if they're very different, you would not be. But the more likely type of interference involves information you learn today affecting or information or material from 5, 10, 15 years ago. Things that are similar, again, similar names or concepts or places, things. As long as there are characteristics they share in common, you're subject to interference. And it's more likely to be retroactive than proactive. So those are the reasons why we forget: lack of use, lack of cues, and interference. We also forget, uh, well, there are a couple because there are physiological reasons. You may have an injury to the brain, there may be dementia. There are actually a number of reasons. But we'll stick with the lack of use, lack of cues, interference. I don't want to make it complicated too much. Finally, there was a notion that there are things we never forget unless there's some physical reason, as mentioned before. And these are flashbulb memories, clear, dramatic, unparalleled memories, things you will never experience again, and really stick in your mind because they're meaningful and there's just not that interference component. These are not traumatic again, but rather dramatic. Where were you when something happened? You saw, again, if you're old enough, 9/11. If you weren't at the towers, if you were there, it probably is too traumatic to have a clear memory. In fact, you may not have a clear memory at all in that case. So these are very clear memories that are dramatic, but not traumatic, that stick with you. There's great specificity, and you literally may have them your whole life and remember with great clarity. Many memories are reconstructed. There is sort of a reconstruction or reconsolidation of memory, another term that's used in your text, because as we talk about it, we sort of modify the memory, and there may be a little bit of that with a flashbulb memory, but probably less subject to that. Um, I've had a few issues with my phone. Sorry for my going so quickly. Apparently, if someone calls in, it interrupts the tape. So I've had a few people call in, so I rushed through this a little bit. Um, I don't. Yeah, it's still going. That's good. So, but I think this. You may have to replay this a few times. But I intentionally was moving a bit quickly. For that reason, just because I've been running into some issues with that. So please feel free to email me with questions at wgrodman@norwalk.edu. Call me at 216-1545. This should put you in pretty good stead for the exam, and please focus on these terms. And there'll be a link on Blackboard for you to access, of course, this tape. All right, bye-bye.